Clerk.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I too want to congratulate those who have worked on the bill, following on from that contribution from the Select Committee Chair, Jonathan Young, and I identified with his comments about 150 pages of jargon. It sounds like our Select Committee papers that we get on a Thursday morning. No one wants to wade through that if they don't have to, it's fair to say. And this bill is an attempt to make sure that retail investors and ordinary folk who do wish to get into this space have the kinds of protections that they ought to be offered. It's about transparency and the efficient functioning of markets. So I want to congratulate Ms Dalzell, Ms Curran and others who have worked on this over a period of time, the Minister, Mr Foss, for guiding this through the House. There's a huge amount of detail in this bill and the legislation relating to securities law, over 700 pages, as many have pointed out here in this pamphlet that we have before us. The purposes of the bill are commendable: to promote the confident and informed participation of businesses, investors and consumers in the financial markets, and that cannot be argued against. Nor can the other main purpose, which is to promote and facilitate the development of fair, efficient and transparent financial markets. Markets, after all, are a source of information to guide capital flows, so that capital flows to its most efficient point, and that underpins good economic development. So we commend the purposes of this bill, and the way it flows out means that Labour will be supporting this bill through its third reading. There are plenty of other areas, of course, that the government is neglecting. This is a part of the economic picture. The markets, the effective functioning of markets is the starting point for many, but there are other policies that guide the economy as a whole that are not contained within this legislation. It's taken 5 years to get this particular bill to the House, and it's strange that we're passing it under urgency. Perhaps speaks to some poor House management, as with the previous bill, but nevertheless we commend the actual material within it. We do have concerns, and Mr Lotwing is right, I need to raise this new material, about the general direction of government policy, which doesn't deal with the bigger issues of monetary policy reform, doesn't really shape an export-led recovery, doesn't deal with savings and the capital depth issue. We're talking about transparency here where capital flows to, but the actual capital depth problem that we have as a country, where we don't have the savings that other countries do to support an export-led recovery, is a concern that this government seems to sidestep time after time after time. Likewise with pro-growth tax reform. We know a capital gains tax, the OECD, the IMF, every other Western country, former Treasury head and so on, all say that New Zealand should have that kind of pro-growth tax reform, should have a capital gains tax, should have research and development tax credits, but this government has its head in the sand. At least it is sorting out these nuts and bolts. And for that, I want to commend this government's work. Of course, it was started by a Labour government, and let's not forget that. Labour started the financial markets reform process, and we are pleased that the government are continuing our good work. Leanne Dalzell set up, of course, the Capital Markets Development Task Force. This will be something of her legacy as she leaves this place. That was set up in 2008 to develop a blueprint and action plan for the development of New Zealand's financial system. So we're pleased that the government is acting on this and acting on the recommendations of the Task Force's report, one of which was a single market regulator. The Labour-led government, of course, took a number of measures in the wake of the financial crisis, which accelerated their process, these measures, and the spate of finance company collapses. And the Crown Retail Deposit Guarantee Scheme, of course, is still fresh in people's mind as the government bailed out to the tune of $1.6 billion in taxpayers' funds to South Canterbury Finance, and that was largely due to poor monitoring. We don't know the extent that that was due to poor monitoring. We do know that their dodgy loan book increased 25% in 4 months at one stage, and the Minister of Finance did not have oversight of that, did not request appropriate briefings, though he could have got them through the Treasury from the Reserve Bank about the state of those dodgy loan books and the kind of risky lending that was being done against the blank cheque of the government. So taxpayers have forked out hundreds of millions of dollars unnecessarily, we know, in the case of the Crown Retail Deposit Guarantee Scheme. Of course, Labor put it in. Let's not forget that Labor put it in a 24-hour period to address the issue of a run on banks. So the basic premise was sound, we know that, but it was not monitored. And it's the failure of monitoring by this government that has cost the taxpayer hundreds of millions of dollars. Unfortunately, the government was too afraid to investigate it. They didn't really want the light of day on that poor monitoring because it would have reflected badly on the current government, and I think they owe New Zealanders an apology on that front. They really do owe New Zealanders an apology on that, and I hope that some member from the national benches will apologise for the hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars that have been lost unnecessarily through that Crown Retail Guarantee Deposit Scheme, and particularly through the failure of monitoring of the Minister of Finance. No, Mr. Lotuinga, it's the failure of monitoring that is the problem, not the scheme itself. Of course, this government didn't remove the scheme because they knew that it was a good scheme, but they did fail to watch it closely. And of course, I don't say this on my lonesome. This is something that the Auditor General, Lynn Provost, drew attention to in her report. And that begs many questions, and it has just been swept under the carpet. This poor oversight of the scheme has been swept under the carpet by this government because they know it would be incredibly embarrassing to see those hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars that went without any real investigation exposed to sunlight. And of course, the Finance and Expenditure Committee did request that the Treasury come before it to explain what had happened in that failure of monitoring after the Auditor General's report revealed the extent of the issue, and the then Chairman was very keen to sweep it under the table. I expect we may get an apology out of him later in the piece. I'm certainly hopeful as I look across the floor. He says he's sorry for the speech, and that tells you this is a government that doesn't really care about these bigger issues, about where taxpayer money goes. I say they should hang their heads in shame, and many of them are there at the back. I can see hanging their heads in shame at the behaviour of this government around this scheme. But the bill itself, back to this bill, not what's not in it, not the things that aren't in it that ought to be, but this bill itself, in its 700 pages, do implement a new one-stop shop for securities law. These are good steps forward. It's about time, obviously 5 years after Labor kicked the process off, but it is about time that we had these things in. The regulations in the area of derivatives have been inefficient, and Labor does welcome these measures and initiatives by the government to address the problems. Derivatives have been brought within the framework of the four financial products, which includes debt, equity and managed investment schemes. So, Mr. Chair, I think that we can claim that this is a success, a bipartisan approach. It's a shame that some of the earlier bills we debated yesterday were not subjected to the same test, the ones that look at where we go from here about responsible fiscal management were not developed in a bipartisan way, and no doubt they will not stand the test of time in the same fashion, and that is a shame because generally in this area we like to have a bipartisan approach. It's one of those great moments when we can celebrate across the House the value of transparency, of appropriate regulation, of seeing that those who invest, retail investors, don't have the wool pulled over their eyes, that documentation can be clear and that capital can then flow to its best use for the long-term productivity of our country. And so I commend the government for bringing this bill to the House. I commend them for getting it through. Would have liked to have seen it come a little earlier. But transparency and accountability and consequences are important in this legislation as they are elsewhere. They're important for efficient functioning of markets so that markets become good and effective servants and not the terrible masters we know they can be if they're not properly regulated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Green Party to speak to the Financial Markets Conduct Bill.